The story behind my first video, the story of how black residents are isolated, alienated, and marginalized in residency. So 10 days after I published a video titled The Destruction of Black Doctors, How Black American Doctors Are Isolated, Alienated, and Marginalized in Residency, I was called on my cell phone by Lieutenant General Telita Crosland. We spoke for about 40 minutes, and I'm very happy with what she had to say. I'll go into exactly what that is. But first, let me tell you about the story behind that video. In October of 2023, I gave the presentation for my first video at an auditorium at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland. I gave it to a room of high-ranking doctors in the Army, Air Force, and Navy. But actually, that was my second time giving that presentation. The very first time I gave that presentation was to a group known as Excelsior Surgical Society. It was given over Zoom in the summer of 2021. The basic idea of me wanting to give that presentation to that group of people is because if any black doctors were in the Army, Navy, or Air Force and were about to live through the nightmare that I dealt with between 2011 and 2012, it would be someone in that room that did it to them. So after my presentation was completed, there was a question and answer session, and then a high-ranking DHA official, I think it was this guy, but I'm not sure. He's in civilian clothes, so I think it was him. He came forward and said that he would go through my presentation and they would implement all the recommendations that I made. And I'll be honest, thought that was a little strange because my recommendations were quite detailed and they required a lot of hard work. And the way he just casually committed the DHA to doing all these things I thought was unusual. But more unsettling was the fact that after my presentation was done, I heard nothing. It had taken me a decade to put all that information together. And it had taken changes in America for that information to even be discussed in public. And I didn't hear a word. Not a peep, not an attaboy, no follow-up over LinkedIn, no emails, nothing. A few people came up to me after the presentation and said thank you. This woman actually spoke and said, everything he just said is true. I've experienced this, and yeah, we need to do something about this. And for obvious reasons, she stood up and said that. She was the only black doctor. Actually, she was one of at least two black doctors in the room. Ironically, the other black doctor is the dean of the Uniformed Services Medical School. He didn't say anything. So, afterwards, no one contacted me over email, nobody said anything, no one followed up on the presentation. There were even people in the room that I knew from West Point as a teenager. That's right. We knew each other as far back as 25 years ago. They didn't say anything, they didn't stop by to say hi, they just walked right past me. There was also people who knew me who were on Zoom that day or were in a different room who knew who I was. They said nothing either. So, the silence made me think either this presentation was really bad and I embarrassed myself, or it was really good and people feel awkward. And my wife confirmed for me that it wasn't really bad. She usually tells me very quickly when the stuff that I generate is not good. So I concluded that it wasn't bad, but no one wanted to speak about it. If they weren't speaking to me, that meant they weren't speaking to anyone else either, was my theory, which meant that message was about to die with those people in that room. So I thought, I'm going to have to make this as public as possible. So I retired on the 30th of April, 2024. I did write 4 personal messages. First was Lieutenant General Mary Krieger. She goes by Exari now, but when she was my commander in 2013, she was a colonel and I was a captain. And it was right after the events of my last video had occurred. My message, I first congratulated her being promoted to the very highest position for a doctor in the U.S. Army. She was my first commander after Tripler, and she was fair to me. She was very fair. She allowed me to be a good doctor and not be harassed. Then I told her, hey, I'm sending this video to as many doctors as possible. I'm also going to be sending it to as many news outlets as possible. I told her that my goal was not to agitate or to degrade the Army. My goal was to coerce the Army into instituting some protections for black doctors that come behind me. The next doctor that I emailed was Lieutenant General Telita Crosland, the one I mentioned at the beginning of my video. She is the head of the Defense Health Agency, which means She's basically the Surgeon General of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, all at the same time. Sort of. I told her that I'd watched her career from a distance, which was true for many years. I'd watched as she appeared on messages all the way back to the time she was a colonel. And I hoped that she would eventually rise to a position she had risen to, 3-star general. She is also a West Point grad. She's from the class of 1989, and she's also a doctor, family medicine by training. I'd hoped that she would be able to do something about this and told her as much. I also mentioned that I was willing to spend years promoting my video and talking whenever to whoever to spread the message of what is happening to black doctors in the Army. The next was Lieutenant General Xavier Brunson. He's an infantry general, and in 2002 we were in the same unit. He was a major, and I was a lieutenant. He was the executive officer of the battalion, and I was the HHC executive officer of the headquarters. So we worked very, very closely in those roles for about a year. He was the first black man that I saw in the Army and said, yep, that's my role model. That's who I want to be like. I want to be as strong and as smart as him. This is an extremely cool dude. I literally called him just to say, sir, I'm checking out. Thank you for being who you are. And, I will see you on the other side. The last was Brigadier General Jennifer Maris Host. She was my commander in Kuwait when I deployed in 2021. I fell under a reserve unit, and so she is a reserve general. She was good to work with, and she attempted to help me get back into ortho by writing me a very nice letter of recommendation. I appreciated that. Wanted to thank her again, even though it didn't result in me returning. And even though she was in the reserves, I thought she should know there's some bad stuff going on the active duty side. So how did they respond? Well, Lieutenant General Brunson called me about 10 to 20 minutes later. We spoke for about half an hour. It was great to catch up. He told me that he's dealt with some of the same issues and just told me that even though he felt it was unfair that he had to prove himself over and over again, he told me that he thought it was worth it because it's something that has to be done unless we're just content to sit wherever we are placed. He thought it's important to push forward, to make room for people like him and me to come behind him. And I agreed wholeheartedly. So for those who are unfamiliar with the military, he is a 3-star general, just like the first 2 ladies that I mentioned. But it's very possible he's going to become a 4-star general, which would put him on par with as the same rank as our current Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's also a black man right now, and our former Joint Chiefs of Staff from my childhood, Colin Powell. So once I sent my final email, I closed my computer, walked out of the building for the last time, and I figured that would be it. I prepared for a public relations war with my own army. Public relations war, not a real war, if anybody's listening. I posted the video on Black Doctors Facebook group and on the U.S. Army Medical Corps Facebook group, and then I just let the algorithm do what it did on YouTube. My expectation was that nobody would be that interested outside of the medical community, and that it would move within the medical community. I had done a couple of things to just make it more attractive because I had actually posted the identical video without the intro before, and 50 people watched it, 50. So I figured that would happen again, maybe a couple hundred because of the fact that I had sent it to actual groups. But so 10 days after I posted the video, Lieutenant General Crosland texted me and asked if she could call. She said that she had emailed me, but it was likely that I had already left the Army by the time her email came in. So obviously, I kicked my family out of the car. We were actually stopped at the time. I didn't kick them out of a moving vehicle. And I took the call. So, Dr. Crosland tells me that she watched the video and found it very compelling. She is now writing a new policy that would take the power to terminate residents out of the hospital commanders. And from that, I can only assume that based on my presentation, she could see that there's too much opportunity for abuse when the hospital commanders who see these people all the time and have their biases, both interpersonal and perhaps racial, it's just too much potential for abuse. So instead, residency programs in the Army, Navy, and Air Force, remember I told you she's an Army Lieutenant General, so Army 3-star general, but she's currently in a position where she's over the Army, Air Force, and Navy. And so the new policy states that if you're going to try to terminate a resident, whether you're in the Army, Navy, or Air Force, you have to submit that termination request up through her organization, DHA. And then it has to go through a committee where that person's ethnicity is represented. So a doctor or several doctors who are black, if it's a black doctor, will have to be on a committee that reviews this attempt to terminate them. And then after that happens, it will go to her. She'll be in her position for 3 years, and after that, it'll be someone else. Does this eliminate racial bias? Absolutely not. Does it make sure that the nightmare that I lived through won't happen? I think it goes a very long distance to ensure that what happened to me can't happen to someone else. It is a giant leap towards justice. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with graduate medical education, because I do have a lot of people who have subscribed that I assume are not doctors and have said as much that they're not doctors, but they just found my initial presentation interesting. So let me just kind of explain how this works. So every hospital has several residency programs. Their job is to train doctors. If you don't graduate from residency, pretty much, for the most part, you don't get to practice medicine. Doesn't matter if you have an MD. Doesn't even matter if you have a license. Without residency graduation, you cannot get approved to treat patients at hospitals or by insurance companies. This is why the idea that we solve this problem by standing up our own hospitals is not actually a viable situation, because we have 3 of them, but it's just not enough to train enough black doctors. And additionally, they don't have every specialty. So at some point, many black doctors are going to have to go through specialty training in, I would call, ethnic majority institutions. So each department with the hospital is like its own kingdom. They can basically say and do anything they please to you. You're at their mercy. Everyone knows that if you don't graduate, or if they ruin your reputation, you have nothing but debt for the cost of your MD. So the vast majority of people put up no fight at all. They can't afford the risk. So when they want to terminate you, the ACGME, which is the governing body of graduate medical education, mandates that a committee known as a Graduate Medical Education Committee be convened. This is supposed to be in the name of fairness. But unfortunately, that committee is just made up of other residency program directors, fellow kings of their own kingdoms. So it's almost like a criminal case being tried in court where the jury is made up of police officers. The judge that makes a final determination, well, in the military, that's a colonel or a general. In the civilian world, it's a hospital CEO. And they literally can make whatever ruling they please, just as they did in my case. Fairness and justice need not interfere with whatever they want to do. So in the past, in the military, this has been about 98% white men and women at the GMEC, and 100% white men and women at the hospital commander level. And as I said, they will do whatever they want. But now her rule is, sorry, you're going to get to put your recommendation on it, but it's going to go past you. Lieutenant General Crosland is making a rule that they can no longer terminate residents, and instead that resident's case will leave the hospital and go before a board of doctors where their ethnicity is well represented. Now exactly how that's going to work is yet to be determined. Then she'll have the final say based on the recommendations. When she moves on in 2+ years, her replacement will fulfill that role. Now for the West Pointers in the audience, this is probably the coolest long gray line moment for me. The class of 1989 and the class of 2000 teaming up to make the Army a better place. Now, of course, this doesn't stop people from acting in the ways that they did to me and so many other black residents. Isolation, alienation, marginalization, and humiliation. But at least there will be a point where they can't go any further and where a high-ranking individual with their best interest in mind will intervene. But sadly, even when there is a black person at the top of an organization, we can still get abused and mistreated many levels down, where no one can hear us scream, as I like to say. As I said, each department in the hospital is like its own kingdom. A lot of terrible things can go down before it rises to the level of DHA commander. So obviously this change will have to be accompanied by a cultural shift, which educates people on how terrible we can be to one another when one powerful tribe believes they can do whatever they want to people from a weaker or less numerous tribe. And now see, that gets into why I use the language that I chose for the presentation. The presentation that I gave in October 2023 was for all the residency directors in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. As I said before, if any black doctor was in residency and on their way to getting destroyed, it was going to be the people in the room that day that were going to do it. My goal in giving the presentation was to persuade those doctors to reconsider what they were about to do to the minorities in the setting of residency training. I wanted them to consider their own biases and how they might be a problem or a part of the problem. Now, my experience with white American doctors in 2011 to 2012 revealed to me that they have a very different understanding of the word racism. Black people, especially black people in corporate America or in any elite or highly trained profession, we live with what I like to call low-grade racism or subtle racism on almost a daily basis. For context, just look at these comments from the original video. These are people from all walks of life saying, yes, I experienced this. Yes, I live with this. All occupations, pilots, engineers, tech, nurses, government workers, they're all saying the same thing. Unfortunately, white people don't believe in any of this. Oh, also I'll say the vast majority of these comments express a great gratitude for me capturing this very elusive phenomenon where we are teamed up on and gaslit into oblivion. Reality is distorted, facts are manipulated or omitted to suit the dominant tribe. There doesn't seem to be a name for this specific series of events when destroying a career. You could call it career sabotage, but that's not really specific enough. You could call it workplace discrimination, but that sort of, and to a lot of people, suggests one simple thing that one person does. What we're talking about is this series of events, this cooperation among members of the empowered tribe. And because it doesn't have a specific name for that event, I'm going to propose, and for the rest of this video, I'm going to call it getting a tripler special. Okay? So you're going to hear me mention that a few times. A tripler special. All right? Now, so it's not as simple, but it would seem that all black people are experiencing this. And then I'm going to use these black and white balls to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So a lone black person walks into a new workplace. One person has a strong bias and a belief that this person is not capable of doing the job. Or maybe several people have a mild bias that this person isn't smart enough or hardworking enough. Or they just like him less because he's other. The co-workers and evaluators, they proceed to see what they expect to see over the coming months, weeks, and years. They don't see what they don't expect to see, which is a strong performer. Any mistake that they make just reinforces the bias that already exists. This is the racism part. This is the bias part. This is confirmation bias of a racial nature. Okay, now, this is where the tribalism steps in. These white marbles talk among themselves a lot more often than they talk to this black marble. They are more likely to be friends. They are more likely to share opinions. They are more likely to back each other up. They exclude this black ball more and more often. And they generally agree that this is reasonable because the black ball just isn't that good or he isn't a good worker. And any of these white marbles that haven't observed or didn't have a bias, well, they're going to develop a bias based on the conversations with these other marbles. So now you have an entire group of people who share a bias based on one person having a bias. Tribalism has transmitted that bias to all of these white marbles. And although no one is a true certified bigot, although they're out there, everyone has turned on this person. And see, now eventually they give him feedback directly. Eventually. Or they suggest that he's just not that good. He starts to get angry and protest. And now, in addition to believing he is a bad performer, they see him as angry and difficult. He goes to the boss, the higher up. He considers the boss reasonable and good. The boss listens, says he'll talk with the team, all the members of his tribe. But when he talks with the team, unsurprisingly, he trusts them. He accepts their accounts as true and accurate. After all, why would they lie? This is one of the biggest, hardest things to deal with, is that a lot of white people will look to other white people and say, well, why would they lie? And then a black person would be thinking to themselves, why wouldn't they lie? Eventually, this black marble has to go. And he leaves knowing that he could have done the job. He was taken out for no other reason than he was different. Now, this process I just described, hundreds of black folks in the comments said they have lived this. But they simply couldn't prove it. And who would they prove it to anyway? The only reason mine works is because I'm in a military structure where somebody has to answer for what was done to me. If what was done to me was in the civilian world, I don't think anyone would even have to answer for it. So as I said, that complex series of movements, That should be called a tripler special. And actually, I would like those of you who are watching who've experienced a tripler special to post a video. You can leave your face out if you like and just record the ceiling or record yourself silhouetted and just tell me like a 4-paragraph story of how you caught a tripler special in whatever place you work. The key to these stories, though, is that there has to be some obvious contradiction that makes it clear to any third-person unbiased observer how absurd what's going on is. That's hard to do. Why did I actually manage to do what I did? It's because in medicine, the way you undo somebody, the way you destroy a doctor is by documenting everything they do. So they documented everything I did. And I just simply asked them if they could document just a little more. Would you mind documenting me every day? And it's as if they forgot that the 2 records existed. And so when their bias came up and they decided that I had to go, that I had to be terminated, they forgot that they had left a record showing that that wasn't true. So doctors, a lot of times, we can prove the bias because they over-document our mistakes, or they over-document, or they create a lot of documentation to hurt us. But they also create a lot of evaluations. And if you compare the two, a lot of times there's a conflict. One of our biggest problems in America is that black folks share such an intimate understanding of how this racism works, this tripler special, that when speaking to another black person about an experience at work, a lot of us just say, well, you know how it is. And this roughly translates to, these white folks are with me pretty hard right now, and they are cooperating to destroy me, my family, my future, and my way of life. This low-grade racism, or subtle racism as I used to call it, or even unconscious bias, it literally does not exist in the minds of a vast majority of American white people. And in fact, I don't tend to get very political, but organizations such as Fox News, The Daily Wire, which I actually do occasionally watch and do occasionally agree with, they go through a lot of effort to discredit these explanations of complex human behavior because they know there's a segment of the population that will gladly reach for a simple explanation over a complex one. No, there is no unconscious bias. There is no complex series of behaviors. They're simply not smart. And then everyone's happy, everyone who looks like them. But a lot of white folks do not believe in this. And since nobody can show them easy evidence of it, they simply regard it as the ramblings of less capable people who make excuses for their failures. For white people, low-grade racism, also known as lowercase r racism, that's what my wife calls it, or unconscious racism, subtle racism. This is like leprechauns, the Easter Bunny, Santa Claus all having a tea party. See, that's him right there. That's unconscious bias. They don't believe in this guy. How can this be, though? How does this happen? And how can the same demographic that elected Barack Obama, that celebrates football and basketball players, loves Beyonce, rap music, has a black best friend at some point, how can they unleash this pain on Americans? Well, I can't read minds, but after dealing with this for many years, I proposed a theory that most white people believe the following. When you say, you guys are being kind of racist and making things hard for me, what they hear is, you're evil, you hate black people, you're doing all of this on purpose, and you probably use the N-word. And I'm not talking about when you rap along with Drake and Kendrick. You used a hard R to describe black people. Then at some point, they have a mental process. They think to themselves, well, I'm not evil. I don't hate black people. I don't use the N-word. Even when I'm rapping along with Kendrick, Lamar, and Drake, I don't even say the N-word then. I'm not hurting black people on purpose. So then they conclude that they are not racist. So if you give a presentation like the one that I gave, and you use the term racism, they will, in their minds, believe that you are not talking about them. You are talking about someone else. Generally, racism is the tendency to treat people of a different race more harshly than you, while tribalism is something different. Tribalism is a tendency to treat people better because they look like you. Like I said in the first video, the difference between the two can be almost indistinguishable in certain settings, like a hostile workplace where you're the only other for years on end, such as I was. The good thing about tribalism, however, is that this behavior is practiced by everyone and no one can deny it. The science has been confirmed. We are all tribal. So A group of white people may excuse themselves from racist behavior, but they cannot excuse themselves from tribal behavior. So if you describe their behavior in terms of tribalism, it no longer becomes a discussion as if they're doing it. It's a given that they're doing it. So I used tribalism as the term to describe the behavior because I really wasn't talking to black people when I made that presentation. I was giving that presentation on behalf of black people, but I wasn't talking to you. I was talking to people who have a hard time understanding our reality, and so I had to use terms that would not immediately make them defensive, and instead would make them willing to listen and understand. Now, in general, I find that there are 4 major ways that white people understand subtle racism, which, for the record, is pretty much the same as tribalism. I would say subtle racism and tribalism are about the same thing. So yellow. This is most white people that I've ever met. They have a very basic understanding. Don't use the N-word. You shouldn't hate people. Don't be evil. That's about it. They can't really help us because they don't understand what they and other white people are actually doing. Green. They know what's happening and they're actively trying to make it better. These people obviously exist. In medicine, they are very quiet, though. Very quiet. The goal of my presentation was to turn as many yellows into greens as possible. Now, orange. I'm not sure how many of these exist. Their existence is mostly theoretical. Well, partially. These people understand exactly what's going on, but they literally don't care. Not their problem. They have money. Their kids have money. They don't live near black people. They don't have to deal with it. Sucks to be a black person. Next issue. This also includes people in the yellow category who simply refuse to be educated. They immediately reach for, but DEI, but you don't deserve to be there. Most doctors know that DEI doesn't explain what's happening because even if you get into medical school, DEI will never get you out of medical school. It'll never get you into a competitive residency either. So affirmative action really doesn't have a place in a discussion about doctors and residency because after you've started residency, you've already proven yourself through tests and tests and tests. But for the lay people that step into this conversation, they seem to think that that's a thing. So anyway, some of these yellow people, you can see them in these comments right here. They refuse to be educated. They're like a child plugging their ears, calling us crybabies and telling us to get it together. Now red, I'm certain these people exist, and I think at least one of the people from Tripler Orthopedics back in 2011 was actually one of these reds. But they keep themselves out of sight. They're very deceptive. The people that I classify as red, they know how it is. They know about bias and racism, and they love it. They love that they belong to the tribe that's kicking everyone else's ass. They do what they can to ensure that generations of white people will always occupy the top position of strength in America. These are the racists. But as I demonstrated with my marble example, everybody doesn't really need to be racist for this bad stuff to happen to black people. Tribalism takes over pretty early. Although racial bias starts the process, tribalism really completes it and intensifies it. I will never reach a red individual, and my goal is not to even try. Orange, I might be able to convince a few that they're unleashing devastation on folks who could do well in life if they would just take their foot off of our neck. Maybe. But the problem with the orange people is they lack empathy. Yellow. Now my wife wants to fight me on this. In fact, I bet some of you want to fight me on this. I believe that almost everyone that dealt me a Tripler special at Tripler Army Medical Center Orthopedics was pretty much one of these yellow figures. They didn't know what they didn't know. And they certainly weren't going to let an incompetent little black intern or resident teach them something about the world that they didn't know. It made them angry that I would even try to claim that I knew something about them and the world that they didn't already know. And as a result of their anger, they destroyed me. But their anger came from ignorance because I was trying to educate them. And in educating them, I was using racial terms which were then degrading them or, in their opinion, insulting them. They were insulted by my complaint. And instead of taking the time to reflect on what I was actually saying, they went into attack mode. All right? I could even see that then, but they couldn't see it. So I still believe these yellows are very dangerous. People who stay in this yellow mode are extremely dangerous because they can do exactly what they did to me. They're very easily manipulated by tribalism, and they can do bad things. Now, some people want me to use stronger language and condemn the people more harshly. They want me to say, point a finger at them and say, you're racist. But why? Why do we want them condemned? I mean, is it as important that we condemn them, or do we just change the behavior? I don't think condemning them is going to help. See, here's the thing you have to understand, and a lot of people aren't going to like this either. Black people, we're outgunned and we're outnumbered. We cannot deal with white folks in any all-out ideological or physical war, which, of course, nobody wants that. We need a large proportion of white people to align with us and to help us deal with the people who actually want to harm us. You see, our grandparents actually knew that. The architects of the Civil Rights Movement used this principle to get things done. The slaves didn't just walk up off the plantations. They were set free by white people. These were the abolitionists. And depending on how much you agree with ChatGPT, this also includes Union soldiers during the Civil War. They came to our aid. Union soldiers were killed to free slaves, white Union soldiers. Then they protected us during Reconstruction, when people wanted revenge. And when the Union troops eventually withdrew, that's basically when white people stopped protecting us from other white people, Jim Crow swooped in. During the Civil Rights Movement, there were some white folks who really stepped the hell up. The Freedom Rides resulted in several white men getting their asses kicked alongside with our grandparents. The sit-ins, there were white folks right there with us. Look at these pictures. They put their reputations on the line, they put their jobs on the line, and their lives on the line. They stood side by side with our grandparents so that we could have a better life. They would be embarrassed to see their grandchildren doing nothing to help us on the next step. And of course, that next step is acceptance. These people, they were fighting for admission, all right, a chance to participate in the higher economy. Yes, we can have our own, but our own will always be relegated to an inferior position as long as it's kept separate. When we try to do anything more sophisticated, if we stay segregated, we will not have access. That's why our grandparents fought for access. But we've gained access without gaining acceptance, and that's why these conflicts keep happening. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by a measure of 290 to 130 in the House of Representatives and 73 to 27 in the Senate, after a 72-day filibuster. So basically in the House, 130 white congressmen, along with 27 senators, said, we would like to continue to discriminate against black people if that's okay. And they were overpowered by 285 white congressmen and 5 black congressmen. 73 white senators said, yeah, no, you're going to have to give these people some rights. So once again, it's clear to me, we cannot do this on our own. We are overpowered and outgunned. Our best bet is cooperation. And when they're not being fair, our best bet is to calmly show them why they're not being fair and cooperate. Much of my strategy is trying to communicate the full weight of this issue to as many white people as possible so they help us fix the problem by overpowering the ones we will never reach. This is why I use the language of tribalism. If you think that all white people are our enemy, you're sorely mistaken. A lot of them, I'm going to be honest with you, and white people, please don't take this the wrong way, but they just live in an alternate reality where the bad things that I showed you in the first video never happen. Why? Because nobody can prove it to them. It's too sophisticated. The only reason I was able to do it because in medicine, documentation is emphasized as the best way to get anything done, including the undoing of a pesky little surgical resident who needs to be thrown out on the street. They literally documented everything at the guidance of the legal department. I filed a number of complaints, which just created enough extra documentation to prove what was done. If we focus our energy on educating as many white people as possible and bringing them onto our side, we can solve this. They're not our enemies. Assuming that yellow and green categories are actually red sets us up for failure. It makes us angry. Many of the comments tell us we should build our own. I'll dedicate an entire video to this idea, but I'll briefly explain why that doesn't work. If I'm a black kid who wants to be a pilot, should I start building my own planes or stand up my own airline? What if I like military service? Should I start my own militia and set up pay? Should Jackie Robinson have stayed in the Negro Leagues instead of going to the majors? Should blacks have stood up their own football league too? Black folks were locked out of pro football, pro basketball, and pro baseball at one point or another. But now, it would be considered unusual for blacks to be absent from the NBA or NFL. Baseball, so we don't play as much baseball nowadays. But how did this happen? How did it become normal to see a ton of black people playing basketball and NFL and football? And how did it become normal to see a black football player in the quarterback position? It happened slowly and painfully, but now it's normal. Isn't it? I believe this is the way. As I said, I'll explore this idea more in the future. So that's it. I want you to know that I'm very grateful for all the people who've watched the video. It made me feel as if my loss and my suffering wasn't for nothing. I hope that my explanation can be used to help people in similar situations for years to come. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon.